both representing in town and out of town. Silky Shah has been working as an organizer on issues related to racial and migrant justice for over 2 decades. Originally from Texas, she began fighting the expansion of immigrant jails on the U.S.-Mexico border in the aftermath of 9/11. The fact that now you see the gray, right? So the fact that this young person has been in the game for 20 years means that we're talking about young leadership, and I love that, all right? And that's what this is demonstrating. In 2009, she joined the staff of Detention Watch Network, a national coalition building power to abolish immigrant detention in the United States. Now serves as its executive director, writing on immigration policy and organizing, been published in so many things such as Truth Out, Teen Vogue, Inquest, and so much more, including various volumes such as The Jailers Everywhere and Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence, which is on Haymarket. Haymarket is the publisher of our book In Discussion. This evening, Silky has appeared on numerous national, local media outlets. Please go to her information so you can read the complete bio of everything that she does. We are delighted also to have in conversation with us this evening, Cathryn Paul, who serves as the public policy director of a foundationally and critically important organization known as CASA, which represents over 120,000 Black and Latinx immigrants and working families. Cathryn was recently announced, congratulations on this, as one of the University of Maryland's 30 under 30. Again, young leadership taking over. I'm feeling that. Cathryn has driven successful campaigns in the Maryland legislature, resulting in critical victories in Maryland, including legislation to end state and local partnership with ICE, expand tax credits to immigrant taxpayers, healthcare coverage, so much more. Again, go to Cathryn's full information and full bio so that you can learn more about her. Is that cool? Oh, y'all ain't ready. Wait, they not ready. Hold on, they not ready. If they don't respond better than that, we just gonna eat and drink at the bar and we just pack it up, all right? Are y'all ready? That's a lot better because, you know, as we talk about this young leadership, the old folk used to say, Paul and Silas, bound in jail, sing God's praise both night and day. And I hope that Trump might blow me home to the New Jerusalem. I hope it does blow them home. Although seized in the marketplace of human capital. But right now, all I hear trumpeted are blustering boasts about being tough on crime and misleading media made to maintain some manufactured war on drugs that keeps officials chasing the scream of those in need while ignoring their cries for help. Thus, sales swell. More dwell in them here in the land of liberty than anywhere else. Even the smallest or most repentant for of offenses could get you caught up in the maze of mandatory minimums. This mandates a story, at minimum of telling of truth, because this situation has many doing time, and time keeps on slipping into the future. We want to fly like an eagle. But all we see is the new Jim Crow in a societal cage with human rights perverted in the presence of the Most High, human rights deserted, people missing, broken families cry, millions on the inside, dear forgotten. Do we ask why? Seems like folk could care less how they got there or if numbers die in deplorable conditions, their lamentations being met with lamentable lies. Oh, sure, the rulers speak pretty words about equal justice, but modify their verbs to contain no action. Their sentence structure is unbalanced, with a bias to renown that predicates a belief that people of color and poor whites are to be relegated to a subordinate clause. Pardon my grammar, but that ish just ain't right, and the only corrections I see are the glaring ones that need to be made to this criminal injustice system. Both public and privatized prisons are run like rental companies, with individuals treated as junk for storage. This arrangement might have you hauled away, but this ain't Mom's Attica. It's the sad quintessential squelching of souls, with no renaissance of freedom in Florence, more like a crucifixion of lives, an Angola 3 up on crosses of falsehood, fear, and greed. Even the Nazarene would catch the Folsom Prison blues under these conditions. Imagine if the carpenter had to sing a song of stolen liberties. Countless commune in his name, yet act as if the least of these are mere unleavened, worth passing over. Take 2.2 million of the Creator's loved ones locked up in the U.S. Add them to the 21 million of God's children, many just children, carted around the world as chattel, driven by the trade in forced sex and labor, and you got gridlock on the road to any rights, with nobody moving freely. Up next, human traffic and weather. Or not, you choose to reroute your eyes around it, it's still there. Wonder why this absurdity is so out of control? Follow the money, Silky. It's easier to figure when you factor in the foolishness of police districts blowing up their bookings and filling beds. See, this is slavery by any other name. Wait. The loophole in the 13th does call it that, doesn't it? Well, there it is. Easy as 1, 2, 3. The strikes you get before being struck out of the full roster of citizenship, sent down to the minors, disenfranchised. You don't even get that many swings if you're the away team trying to play in the home park of the privileged. Hardworking folk forced to flee their forebears' farms due to falling prices fashioned by free trade agreements, or fleeing violence fueled by arms forged in northern factories and Faustian pacts between our federal and its nefarious friends. Thousands go through hell to get here only to arrive in hell. Surprised? Well, you won't hear tell of this too much. Our welcoming government quells this, trying to keep it on the slide, but now detention is a family affair, with everyday people rounded up together then torn apart. Parents and children made separate, but equal is the pain in their hearts. They were hoping this country would want them to stay, but they discovered that even here, not everybody is a star. For them, there's no hot fun in the summertime because they got iced. So while they're made to dance to the music of orchestrated racism, they look for allies to help take them higher. Question is, will we stand with them? Doing everything we can so that their God-given dignity is respected and they can be themselves again? We are the ones who must make the earth quake. We are the ones and are the trumpets who must make the walls shake with justice that opens doors and blows the captives home. Indeed, we might be the next captives. So either we lock arms with those on lockdown or our spirits languish. Our action is of seismic importance. We better not blow it. The selling of souls. The book is called Unbuild Walls. Come get it from me. While we talk, I'm gonna need y'all to make some real roof-raising radical Red Embers noise. 4, in conversation with Cathryn Paul, make some noise for Silky Shah.
Can you guys hear me? Can we just give another round of applause really quick?
Thank you.
Because that was insane. I just want to thank you and honor you for welcoming us into this space. I want to give a shout out to Red Emmas for hosting the amazing Silky Shah. Oh my goodness, my personal shiro. So I will go ahead and get us started. Wow, that was a powerful way to get us started. My name is Cathryn Paul. It is such a pleasure to be with all of you guys tonight. Thank you for being here on a Friday for this super important and very relevant and very necessary conversation. I am the policy director at CASA. Anybody know CASA? Woo! So CASA is one of the largest immigrant rights organizations in Baltimore, of course, in Maryland, in the Mid-Atlantic region, and now nationally. So we are doing work all across the country, and super excited because this conversation is super relevant to CASA and to Baltimore and to Maryland in particular. Because how many people know that here in Maryland, we have won a really, really powerful victory in 2021. We ended our state and local partnerships to detain immigrants in ICE detention here in the state of Maryland. Woo! And not only that, because of legislation we were able to pass, if you are a police officer, you are no longer able to ask about immigration status at a stop or arrest in the state of Maryland. And so, Silky's in Baltimore! Oh, I'm so excited. It is such an honor. You have been doing such insane, incredible work across the country. the book is so relevant to Baltimore, to Maryland, but so relevant, I think, in this moment in the immigrant rights movement, right? As we are facing a little bit of political...
A little bit.
doom. I don't know what's the right word. But in many ways, we're a little bit at a crossroads, right, in the immigration rights movement, where basically our people's lives, right, are being used as a political talking point, right? And we are coming from Netroots. Some of us are coming from Netroots. Shout out to those at Netroots who are getting into some of these super deep, beautiful conversations, right? And I think this book just comes at the most perfect, most needed moment. So, CASA and Detention Watch Network, we have been in solidarity for years in the fight to end detention and the fight for migrant justice. So I just want to take a moment to honor you, to thank you for your leadership, for all of the work that you have been doing for our people. And I kind of want to start with that. I'm wondering, Silky, if you can just start, you're the executive director of the Detention Watch Network. I'm wondering if you can start by just, for people who may not be familiar with the Detention Watch Network, tell us a little bit about the organization. When was it formed? What is the mission that Detention Watch Network is leading under your leadership?
Thank you. This is like Kat as a hype machine. This is incredible. I'm like, wow. Okay, am I really this great? I don't know.
You are.
But I thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight. It's so wonderful to be here. I went to the old location of Red Emma's years and years ago, and I'm just so thrilled to be back here. When you're like a young, like, lefty kid trying to like find your way, like I always tried to get to those like particular bookstores in every town I would go to, and this was one of them. And it's such an honor to be here. And Baltimore has been such an important site of struggle for so many reasons, and I think it's, like you said, like a really important place where a lot of the convergence of questions around abolition, and most recently with what happened with the bridge collapse, like migrant justice, but in general, like there's so much richness here, and so I'm excited to be here. So Detention Watch Network, I'm really excited to have a couple of my former colleagues here. It's a national coalition. We've been around since 1997, which is a very particular time in immigration law history, where in 1996 there was these two really harsh bills passed that basically doubled the size of the detention system. So before, a lot of people would be maybe going through immigration proceedings, but would be released and going through them at home. And then all of a sudden, a lot more people were being funneled into the detention system. And it was also when we started to see, in the 90s, especially, like a doubling of the prison system, going from 1 million to 2 million people in prison. And so a lot of that was happening at the same time. It came together with a lot of people who had maybe consider themselves like white allies now, but people who were like legal service providers, people of faith who really just saw the impact on their clients and the people that they worked with. But over time, and especially after 9/11, a lot more community organizations started joining. And so today we have a range of groups like Casa de Maryland that are statewide coalitions, or groups that are doing policy and also direct service work, groups that are legal service providers, and people themselves who've been detained or formerly detained, or their family members have been detained or incarcerated, and also grassroots organizations, completely volunteer organizations. It's a huge, huge range. And a lot of what we see our role as is bringing this sort of like a lot of people together to say, actually, no, we don't believe people should be in detention. And just a little bit about the detention system. Currently we have something like 38,000 people currently in detention today. Over the course of the year, you'll have sometimes anywhere from like a couple 100,000 to, at its height, it was 500,000 people a year going through the detention system in really, really squalid, terrible conditions, where there have been numerous deaths over the years. And recently under Biden, we've seen a really big uptick in deaths. And it's a lot of young men, especially, dying in detention of cardiac arrests or often suicide. And so it's a really, really traumatic place to be. Lots of abuse by guards, lots of retaliation if people are protesting their conditions. A lot of these facilities that are county jails, for instance, people will be there for months or years, and they have nowhere to go outside. So people will just be inside for that many months or years. And so the really, really horrible conditions. And Detention Watch Network in 2012, we came to a position of ending detention. We didn't believe that actually this is something that we should do. And so I tell a little bit about that story in the book, but yeah, that's a little bit about DWN.
Guys, shout out to the amazing work that DWN is doing.
I'm all like my.
It is so powerful. So Silky, I'm wondering if you talk a little bit in your book about growing up in Texas, which has a very unique legacy, very different from I feel like sometimes our bubble in Maryland. Can you read us a little something from your book?
Yeah, I know. There's always the question, like, do you do a reading or not? But I'm going to do a reading. So a little bit about this, and a lot of what I'm trying to do in the book is get people to understand that actually the system of immigration enforcement we have is like fully a part of the prison industrial complex, and that's how it operates, and they're not actually separate systems. They're fully intertwined, and part of the reason why we need to embrace abolition is because they're fully intertwined. And so there is a lot of perception that people are undocumented in this country, and it's a crime to be undocumented. It's actually not. It's a civil violation of immigration law, but it is actually a technical crime to cross the border without documentation, and you can get anywhere from like 6 months in jail if you cross the border without documentation to, if you do it twice, you can get 2 years in federal prison. If you do it more than that, or if you have a drug conviction or something else, you can get up to 20 years in federal prison. And so all of that whole sort of policy that I just talked about became initially a law in 1929. I know this is a moment where a lot of us are going back to the 1920s, 100 years ago, when these policies, it was a really anti-immigrant environment. And so these policies were passed that started putting immigrants in prison for the act of crossing the border. So I tell the story about that law, which is called the quote-unquote Undesirable Aliens Act that passed in 1929. And so this comes after that. About 75 years after the Undesirable Aliens Act passed in Congress, I found myself frequently trekking back and forth on Interstate 35 between Austin, where I lived, and Laredo, a border town in South Texas. In 2004, the United States Marshal Service solicited proposals for a 2,800-bed, privately operated jail dedicated for migrants being prosecuted for unlawful entry and reentry. Local media dubbed it the Laredo Super Jail due to its size. I had recently graduated from college and was working as an organizer at Grassroots Leadership, a Southern-based economic and racial justice nonprofit. My friend from college and turned coworker, Bob Leibel, and I had been coordinating a national campaign around university divestment from private prisons when rumors of the jail began spreading. Together with our comrade, Carlos Villarreal of the Texas Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, we began traveling to Laredo to meet with community members in and around the city to gather information about the proposal and build a base of support against the jail. With local residents and statewide organizations, we came together to form the South Texans Opposing Private Prisons Coalition to block construction of the super jail. Laredo was bigger than the other Texas border towns considering prison expansion at the time, but not so big that we couldn't secure a meeting with the county commissioner or the bishop. We would meet at various local haunts, Salsa's, the Tex-Mex restaurant serving sushi, or Espuma's, a downtown cafe with doilies for placemats that seemed to be permanently decorated for Easter. After ordering a round of mariachis, the Laredo term for breakfast taco, we would make our case against the super jail. We were met with a mix of reactions. The bishop told us he agreed with us, but said he would not come out publicly against the jail. Some county commissioners were open to hearing us out. Many private prison companies, often coordinating with local officials to finance the prison, vied for the contract. But as usual, CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, and the GEO Group were the most aggressive. At a public hearing on the jail, I remember feeling confident in the opposition group we had assembled and shown up with until a busload of CCA guards arrived and piled into the room to voice their support for the new jail. To persuade the public against the super jail, we employed various arguments over the course of the multi-year fight. that the jail would have a negative impact on the longer-term economic development of Laredo, that the jail would destroy the natural habitat of the local ocelot population, and of course that the jail was unnecessary and the US government should instead deprioritize migrant prosecutions. Little did we know that the following year, a new program would be rolled out in Del Rio, another Texas border town, that would make unlawful entry and reentry prosecutions a central component of the US border regime. So I then go on to tell the story about how this program called Operation Streamline went into effect all across the border, where they would do prosecutions en masse. So like in Tucson, for instance, they would have a dozen people chained at their ankles, at their waists, at their wrist, and all of them having a single ruling applying to them at the same time. So like the idea of due process was a complete farce in that scenario, and you would have dozens of people ending up then in US Marshals jails, and then sometimes in Federal Bureau of Prisons facilities. And this is sort of the system that starts building up under Bush, and then Obama just takes it further. Obama actually, like, in so many ways, and we'll talk about this in a minute, really
We're going to talk about Obama.
We're going to talk about Obama. Yeah. But in so many ways, just like really brings up the number of prosecutions happening at the border and builds out that infrastructure so that actually Operation Streamline is operating in every basically port of entry or area on the border, except for California, by 2011. And so more and more people are being funneled into the system, and all this apparatus is there. And this is basically what the Trump administration uses in 2018 to carry out the systemic separation of families. So it was actually people who were crossing the border with their children who would be separated from their children, and their kids would be sent to shelters or detention camps, and their parents would be prosecuted under 1325, which is unlawful entry, and spend 6 months in prison. So that was how we started getting, this is all just sort of building on each other and really understanding, yes, we have this whole system under ICE, but the thing about Texas and doing this work there, I was technically at the time, we talk about this, I was considered a criminal justice advocate, like that's how we talked about ourselves, but every single facility I was fighting was filled with immigrants. So it was like every single prison was like an immigrant, immigrants were there, and we were like that was just like a separate conversation happening. So I think that's why that connection, it actually isn't separate, but the way we talk about it, sometimes it is.
Yeah, that is so powerful. And I think that excerpt, I want to encourage you guys, get into that chapter because it is insane. I think recognizing how the history of sort of like the evolution, really recognizing the evolution of this over time, right? And how we have sort of, how basically our government has set up this structure, right, for COVID to happen, for mass deaths to happen, right, in prison. And hearing you talk, I'm reminded the legislation in Maryland that we were able to get passed. Oh my goodness, if you guys ever have time to go back and look at some of those debates, I mean, just straight up legislators being like, this partnership, this ICE partnership, to basically Airbnb our, jail beds to, ICE is bringing in too much money, and we just need to keep it rolling, right? Just like the definition of, profit over people, and so much to get into. But I do want to ask you a little bit about the title of your book. Oh, yeah. So, Unbuild Walls. It's based on a quote, right? An Ursula K. Guin quote.
Le Guin, yeah.
Le Guin, sorry, from The Dispossessed. What is the significance? Tell us where you came up with the title.
Yeah, so the quote's on the back. It's kind of funny because it seems like it's a blurb, and Ursula K. Le Guin didn't vote me. It looked really bad on the galley. I was like, something needs to change about this. So the quote is, "Those who build walls are their own prisoners. I am going to go fulfill my proper function in the social organism. I'm going to go unbuild walls." And the thing about The Dispossessed, I don't know how many folks have read The Dispossessed. It's a really important book in the context of sci-fi for a lot of different reasons. But it's this book about it was like the perfect book to read when I was 20. It's a book about these very big ideas around societies and how they're formed and how you make choices about how societies function. And in so many ways, it's trying to like push the idea of like how do we actually create systems where we don't have to put people in cages, where we don't have to be in these situations. And so there's this technical wall between these societies, and part of it for me, and I think in a lot of ways, maybe people see this book and be like, oh, this is like a book about border abolition or unbuilding the border wall, which sure, down for unbuilding the border wall, but for me, so much of it is about unbuilding the prison, jail, and detention center walls, because part of the way that bordering happens is through the prison industrial complex. That's what we saw. That's what we saw, especially after 9/11. It was, here we're extending the war on terror, but actually the way the war on terror, the domestic war on terror worked was through the criminal legal system. And we saw this ramp up that I was just sort of referencing in Texas. And so for me, the title, like that, that book is both getting at this question of let's not, one of the societies is sort of a prison abolitionist society, but it's also about human connection and how we actually build up so many walls between us. And, in the context of this, yes, it's about unbuilding the border walls and the detention center walls, but it's also so much for me about unbuilding the walls between our movements for social change, because often what happens is, and we can talk about this more, but in the immigrant rights movement, so much of the perception has been immigrants are good and they're productive and they're better than everyone else, and that's why we should support them. And a very exclusionary, like, we're not criminals, we're not terrorists. That definitely have, that kind of perspective, without sort of understanding the systems that have led to us being the world's leading incarcerator, which actually has basically funneled more immigrants into the system. And so often, and I write about this in the book, you have instances where, for instance, in the Trump era, Louisiana was doing a lot of criminal justice reforms, and they ended up reducing the number of people in facilities there, and all these counties and all these jobs were sort of lost, and then ICE and Trump swooped in and they made all of those facilities into ICE detention centers. And so Louisiana became one of the leading detention states in the country. And so there's this like recycling of beds, and often, folks there weren't necessarily thinking about that impact of what would happen if these facilities stayed open. Similarly, so much of the work that's happened in the immigrant rights movement often emphasizes and accepts the premise of the criminal legal system and accepts this idea that immigration is a public safety issue, which it's not. It's just a lie that's been told to us over and over again. And so I think if we do that work of unbuilding those walls, if we're saying, okay, actually, we want to break free, and we really want to understand that this is about collectivity and us doing, and like the impact of these systems on all of us, not just a set of us, we can get a lot further.
That is so beautiful, and I think the concept of unbuilding walls between us, right, is also speaking to like the ability for us to transform as organizers, right? Yeah. Like, what do we do when we're stuck in this world of what we think immigrant rights looks like, right? And when we break down those walls, right, and recognize actually it's much further beyond this, right? I love what you said, because when there's beds, they will be filled, right? And I think you have done such a wonderful job diving into that in the book. The other thing you spoke about was this narrative, right, around immigrants being criminals or immigrants being better than everyone else. I promised we would get back to Obama. I want to read a quote that you actually included in your book. Actually, you have a whole chapter on Obama, but I want to include a quote.
A lot of processing going on in that chapter.
I want to read this quote. Even as we are a nation of immigrants, we're also a nation of laws. Undocumented workers broke our immigration laws, and I believe that they must be held accountable, especially those that may be dangerous. That's why over the past 6 years, deportations of criminals are up 80%. And that's why we are going to keep focusing on enforcement resources on actual threats to our society. Felons, not families. Criminals, not children. Gang members, not a mom who is working hard to provide for her kids, will prioritize just like law enforcement does every day. That is a direct quote from our former president. So, as I mentioned, you dedicate a whole chapter to the Obama era, unpacking how these reforms led to some of the highest detention and deportation numbers we have ever seen. So talk to me about this quote. Talk to me a little bit about the good immigrant, bad immigrant narrative, right? That is still so deep in our movement.
Well, it's having a resurgence right now. It's kind of incredible.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about why the reflection on the Obama era is so important.
Well, I think there's a couple things about the Obama era that are important. So the first one is really this sort of emphasizing of criminalization. So Obama really, and the administration really believed that the best way to fix the immigration system was to target those people who were criminals. And so that was, or who were quote unquote criminals. So and that was like the progressive way to do it. We're going to help those people who are good, but by going after the bad immigrants, we're actually going to fix the system. And it was kind of a play because he was trying to pass comprehensive immigration reform and get Republicans on his side, and so moving in this direction. But they also Democrats very much believe in the war on crime narrative and perspective and the system and how it works. And so the shift was, and this was like one of the big reforms from the Bush era, where we had a lot of really large-scale raids on communities. Sometimes 400 people would be detained in a community. There'd be worksite raids. It'd be absolutely destructive to communities. Obama decided to more closely tie immigration enforcement to the criminal legal system, which the U.S., again, has one of the world's largest, with 2 million people in prisons and jails. And so using collaborations with sheriffs, private prison companies, of course, local law enforcement, this whole big carceral apparatus we had, and more closely tying it to immigration, Obama essentially became, quote unquote, deporter-in-chief. He was coined deporter-in-chief. And it was through this program called Secure Communities, but a few other programs as well, where you started to see more and more people funneled into the system. And so that was the strategy. And it was, again, this idea, and sort of what this quote says is just like, well, let's just accept that immigration is a public safety issue. It's not. Immigration is about family relationships, it's about labor, it's about seeking refuge. It's not about public safety, it's not about national security. Those are constant lies that are told to us, but they really accept that premise. And so as Obama did this, we saw basically the highest level of formal deportations we had ever seen in the nation's history. So there's a lot of sort of distinctions between types of deportations, but the particular type of deportation that was prevalent under the Obama administration, and it's going up a little bit right now, but we've actually brought them down significantly since then. Formal removals basically means that once somebody is removed from the country, deported, they have a 5-year bar to reentry. If they try to come back, then they could trigger a unlawful reentry prosecution, which means that they could then end up in prison for 2 years, sometimes longer. And so what we saw is, I think by 2012, it was over 400,000 people had been formally removed, really the highest numbers. And over the course of those years, 3 million people had been formally removed. And it's different than sort of what's happening now, where mostly it's expulsions, people turned away at the border, but they don't have that same bar to reentry. And so what happened was, it was not just growing the number of people who were being deported, some of the highest numbers, it was also growing the number of people in the federal prison system when they were attempting to come back. So I think that is, for me, in so many ways, the strategy for reform was to say, we're going to make this, it's sort of like the Michelle Alexander, like New Jim Crow, like the color blindness stuff. Like, we're just going to actually be very technocratic and go after the system and go after these individuals in this particular way, who are quote unquote criminals, and that's how they grew the system. And then on the other side, I tell a lot of a story about Obama's reformist nature, and so it was actually in contradiction. This whole idea was like, we're going to target quote unquote criminals. On the flip side, on immigrant detention, their whole strategy was, well, actually, detention's not for quote unquote criminals, and so we're going to make a nicer civil detention system. And the whole strategy there ended up growing the number of detention centers and having the Obama administration work more closely with private prison companies to create nicer facilities. And so we went from early Obama, less than 50% of immigrant detention was private facility, privately operated. And by the end of Obama, it was like 70%. And so it was in contradiction. On one side, they're like, oh, well, they're not criminals. We're going to actually put them in nicer facilities. And on the other side, we're only going after criminals. It was completely in contradiction to each other. And in both scenarios, more people were deported, detention grew. And that's really what the sort of tragic story of the Obama administration was. And it also, because they accepted the premise and they said, we're going after quote unquote criminals, we're going after dangerous people, that just gave so much more fodder for the Trump campaign and for the Republicans, who then really built upon the system that Obama expanded.
And you also do such a great job laying out how all of what you just described is so deeply racist in the book. And, you know, as you know, a daughter of immigrants, I'm thinking about the impact on Black immigrants, right? Who are more likely to be pulled over, right? More likely to be stopped by the police, and therefore more likely to be transferred to ICE, right? The other thing I'm just thinking about after hearing you talk about the good immigrant, bad immigrant narrative, right? And as you write about in the book, is that birth of like that conversation that was happening during DACA.
Yeah.
Right? And I think you have done such a wonderful job kind of painting that picture. Like, what does it mean to say, and we see this, right? We see people coming to testify, coming to share their stories, and they're saying, like, I've got straight A's in school, I've done everything perfectly, I'm volunteering, I go to church, XYZ. And for us to say, like, stop, you don't need to say any of that, it does not matter. You belong just because you are, period.
Well, and I think one thing, I mean, I know this is like, I appreciate this because I feel like we do need to get to a hopeful place in this conversation. And I think what was so powerful, so it's like you have this side of the Obama administration, which is making everything worse, but it's actually galvanizing so many people. And you see this rise of the immigrant youth movement, which was phenomenal in putting their bodies, their lives on the line to say, no, actually, this is not okay. Stop taking our loved ones. No, we're actually going to stand up for our parents and not do this no fault of our own nonsense. You also had, this was, I mean, the Obama era was the rise of like the Black Lives Matter movement. Yeah. And in places like Baltimore and Ferguson and all these individuals, young people who are seeing, oh, wait, we're not going to accept this premise. We're not going to accept this anymore. And actually, it was both this understanding that the immigrant rights movement needed to actually be a racial justice movement. And because Obama more closely used the criminal legal system, they started to understand the criminal legal system better. And we were able to more clearly say, okay, how can we throw a wrench in this? How can we change this? How do we understand these fights together? And so I think it's important to understand a lot came through that, and Obama in particular and what he stood for, and then seeing the contradictions there, I think opened up a lot of space to give rise to what got us to DACA. I mean, it would not have happened without the immigrant youth movement, and also the fights against deportations.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are actually, I have another question for you, but I just want to remind the audience, I'm going to open up for questions in just a second. So get your questions ready. I think we'll probably have time for a question or two, right, Silky? Yeah. So this is, I know we were getting to a hopeful note. So this is a little reality check, and then I want to hear a little bit more on the hopeful side. Throughout the book, you're also celebrating like the many, we talked about what we were able to get done here in Maryland, right? But you're celebrating all the really powerful victories that have happened across the movement. But you've also done that while also recognizing, right, that our movements are imperfect, right? Our movements are super racist. and in many ways have, as we talk about like our long-term vision for abolition, right, have hurt that movement in some ways. So I want to hear from you, where do you think advocates have hurt those efforts toward immigrant justice, right? And as we're sort of entering into this, what I view as sort of a new era for immigrant justice, what is your advice as we are striving, right, to include abolition at the core of all of our campaigns?
Yeah, no, and I think it's so critical that we actually start really reckoning with this, because we are in a really, really tough spot on immigrant justice work right now. And I think part of that is, I talked about the Obama administration and the Democrats generally, which have often sort of tried to placate Republicans and ceded ground, which has really led us to this point, but also a lot of like Beltway, DC groups and immigrant rights groups have also like reinforced a lot of these frames. And so you have the good immigrant versus bad immigrant frame, but so much of the way the immigrant rights movement over the last 20, 25 years has operated, and it's really the logic of how immigration reform has happened for a long time, which I write about in the book, is this idea of comprehensive immigration reform, which is we're going to provide some relief for the people who are living here while we also make a lot of trade-offs towards more border militarization and more criminalization. And so it becomes the good immigrant versus bad immigrant in that scenario is the old immigrant versus the new immigrant. And so the whole situation right now, the whole conversation now is completely about the border. And part of the problem is that the immigrant rights movement and the funders who supported it and the space that it's taken up has only really focused on those immigrants, even which is not actually true. Like you look at like groups like Casa de Maryland or Make the Road, like so much work happening with people seeking asylum, so much incredible work to help people who are newly arriving. But the conversation in DC ended up really saying the most important thing is to get legalization of the 11 million undocumented people, and we're gonna cede ground to the right more and more just to get that. And the reality is, the last time there was like a really major bill to try to do that in 2013, more than 10 years ago, the idea that we're going to get a legalization bill is just far gone now. It is just not even in the conversation because we've ceded so much ground. And in 2013, they added this like major border surge amendment that would have been $46 billion. And it was just like, how much money can we throw at border militarization? And what we've seen is that it's, I think analysis was saying this, it's manufactured a crisis at the border. It's created these conditions where people are being incarcerated. There's more, military contractors. There's so much that's happening. There's so many people who are dying. It's making it that much more perilous, that much more heartless. And people are not getting relief. And actually, if there were avenues, if there was a system that actually functioned and the whole agenda wasn't just to stop people and deterrence, which doesn't actually work, we could see a really different scenario there. If we had more freedom of movement, if we had more legal pathways for people, it would actually look very different. But the problem is that so much of the narrative and resources have emphasized this idea of, we help the old immigrants while we're, deterring the new immigrants. And what it ends up doing is that it further dehumanizes immigrants generally. And it's really hard to make our case for the people who are living here in that context. And so that's where we're at right now. And the Biden administration is bending over backwards to say, look at us, we're to the right of the Republicans on the border. And I know I'm supposed to get somewhere hopeful. So it's been really hard. The last 2 weeks, especially after that debate, I was like, I don't know. What are we gonna do? But I think it's so important. And so what I've been trying to do with this book is say, actually, abolition is a really helpful guide. And if we stop accepting the premise that immigration is a public safety issue, that this is about national security, if we actually understand the prison industrial complex and how the political economy of these systems work that reinforce the idea that we need more people in prisons or that we need to keep these jobs or all these other things, and actually say, no, what is the vision of the world that we want? And I think 2020 was such an incredible moment where we actually started to do that. And we said, no, we want this money, all this money going to the war machine, all this money going to the carceral economy to go to education, to go to healthcare, to go to to care for ourselves. And I think we are in a place where more and more people believe that. As much as it feels like we're in a backlash moment around these things, and especially with those people who are in power, and the reality is that governor of my home state of Texas, Greg Abbott, is basically running immigration policy at this point, and the Democrats are falling for it. A lot of people see through it, and I think the campaigns, one here in Maryland, in 6 other states to end detention completely, are so phenomenal. And I think because people are so, I think, really stuck, I think this is a moment to say, actually, what is that vision? What is the vision of freedom of movement? What is the scenario where we have people who've been deported who are able to come back? How do we start really shutting down more detention centers, working together to end pretrial detention, to do all the work to actually say, this is affecting all of our communities?
Whew, yeah. I mean, I will say I think this book is a must-read for activists who are in this movement, because there are so many ways, and as I'm sure many people in the room can imagine, like when you're in the thick of a campaign, right? And you're making these last-minute decisions. You are thinking through, what do I need to do? What needs to be said? Like, what do they need to hear, right, to get this to the finish line? How can we, every day, at every moment, and every step of that campaign, be ready to check ourselves, basically, right? And be able to meet the immediate needs of our people while also not hurting our long-term vision, right? So I promise we will open for questions.
We probably don't have a lot of time, but maybe one or two.
We don't have a lot of time. Anyone with a question? I see
What
two
we're going
already.
to do is come around with the mic, and as Cathryn just said, we don't have all of the time in the world. We could discuss this for 2 more hours, but instead of doing that, we want to keep our questions and comments relatively truncated and brief so that we can get a few folk in. And I'm going to apologize in advance because at some point I'll probably have to cut off our questions. And so if I cannot get to you, then certainly come up and meet our authors, which I want you to do afterwards anyway, when we adjourn. Of course, we always invite diversity questions, but let me see right now the hands that had a question. I see 1 and 2 right here. So we're going to, did I see 2 or 3? We'll just come right this way.
I think there's one over there. There's one more over there, but
I love where you're coming from. So I'm a former immigration official. I'm a former State Department consular officer, and I was part of the U.S. Immigration system that operates abroad. With 212E authority, with La Lista, with the CBP1 app, there's a move towards, extraterritorializing immigrant processing, right? The decision happens in Mexico, it happens in Guatemala, it happens there. I'm asking this from my heart because I don't know how to fight this. What's the movement and abolitionist response when the decisions, even the detention, even the camps, don't even exist in the United States?
It's a great question, and I don't have a full answer for this. And I think so much of the book that what I'm trying to do is get people to understand that immigration is a racial justice issue, and actually we need to be in solidarity with broader movements, for Black liberation movements, and et cetera, and understand that those fights are in struggle together. But I think the thing I mention a little bit, but not a lot, is that also the immigrant rights movement has been a very patriotic, pro-American, pro-war in a lot of ways movement, and I think some of that is starting to shift now, which has been really remarkable. But it's so important that we actually have a deeper understanding. So there were so many years in the immigrant rights movement where they would be it's actually bad to talk about root causes of migration because it doesn't poll well. And you're just that's ridiculous. Actually, the US is, has created all these conditions, and very different than the 1980s. There was a sanctuary movement that actually was very, very connected to what was happening in Central America and the U.S. role in Central America and supporting people. And so I think at some level, my response to that is yes, the U.S., there's this book called Empire of Borders by Todd Miller, that shows how the U.S. is sort of like extending the border in different parts of the world, and these interdiction models, which is very common in Australia and Canada and other places. And the U.S. is doing more of that. And I think part of what we need to do is come back to this question of what does it mean for us to look like an internationalist movement, and start having those relationships and thinking about how to support people. I don't think there's a clear-cut answer right now, but we really have to start those conversations and say, okay, what does it look like? Because even now, the U.S. just came together with Panama to actually have a strategy to deport people from the Darien Gap whenever they're trying to come to the U.S. Like, all those things are happening. So it's like both here, really, like in our advocacy strategy, saying this is not okay. What you're doing here is going to actually lead to more deaths. There's no question about that. And then building those relationships abroad. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation tonight. I'm really enjoying it. I have a question about the language of border activism. I understand why the right does it, but I don't understand why on the left refugees are called immigrants. It seems pejorative.
Why refugees are called immigrants?
Yes, because if someone's a refugee, there's an inherent sympathy for this is someone who's destitute, who's fleeing, this is someone we should help. Whereas someone who's an immigrant, oh, that's someone terrible who's coming to take our jobs. And so framing it that way is just very uncomfortable to me. Am I the only person who feels this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a question I have about that sense that you have as immigrant as a pejorative name. Like, I understand what you're saying, but I think it's something that you should examine. But I think otherwise...
hang on, I'm not saying I see it that way. I'm saying in the same way that Trump says Palestinian.
Right, but I also think that, like, no matter what word is it, if it's asylum seeker, if it's refugee, if it's migrant, if it's immigrant, all of those things mean the same thing to all of them. I think there's not actually a distinction in a lot of ways. And so I think at some level, part of it goes back to, one thing I'll say, I think one thing that's been so challenging about the border conversation and in this sort of like humanitarian border conversation that's happening right now is that so much of the narrative is like, these are desperate individuals who are struggling, who's seeking refuge and all. And it's like, yes, absolutely. Some of those individuals are. Some people are coming for opportunity. Some people are coming to reunite with family. But there's this way that we talk about like asylum seekers or refugees in this way that actually takes away from the agency of the people who have a lot of agency, who've made really hard decisions for their lives to make sure that they can stay safe and do the things that they need to do. And so what's so important for us to do is to actually lift that up and not just be in this sort of like savior complex space in this work. And so I think that's really important. But I think on the Dem side, I mean, in so many ways, I think the Democrats have built this system as much as the Republicans have, and in some cases more so. I mean, if you look at Clinton and Obama and now what Biden is doing at the border, just really, really extreme scenarios. So I think there's so much emphasis placed on language, and I do think it's so important that we move away from this criminalizing language. But I also think so much of this is about building power and building vision for where we want to go, and that is what we should probably examine more. I think there's one more question over here. Thank you.
Yeah, see a couple more hands. We'll try to move quickly and get through what we can.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I work with kids in the public school system, so it's not just like I don't have to work in the legal system to know that there is a lot of immigrants out there, and just like it's so great to work with all of them. Like half of my kids are either themselves coming here or their parents are coming to this country for the first time, and it's great to hear all their stories and like get to meet all of them because they're all just human beings. So I would be really interested in, given that you've worked with so many organizations, just hearing your own experience working with migrants and what it was like for them to just go through such a difficult experience, but at the same time also like getting to connect with people who have all these different stories and different life experiences kind of coming together in a way that you're saying, like, what does that collective organizing kind of look like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious actually if Kat has something to say about this, especially in Baltimore and what the work has been like in Maryland, because I think so much for us, it's actually like, a lot of what DWN does is bring people together. And I think for so many of the folks that we work with, especially who are formerly detained, it's been so powerful to be with other people who've have gone through similar struggles and had similar experiences, and then feeling like actually together they are able to do something together. But I don't know if you want to share a little bit about.
I mean, our community is beautiful.
Yeah.
We're just like bringing so much to the vibrancy of Baltimore, of Maryland. And, you know, one thing I want to highlight about Dignity Not Detention, the detention center bill in Maryland, was that was led by like community members, really and truly. They were the people who were sharing their stories, who were outside protesting. We had civil disobedience. I mean, the list goes on. And there's just been, in Maryland in particular, this just beautiful, powerful movement of people just fighting for their lives and families. And everything is connected, but for folks who are following, and I'll do a quick CASA plug. Over the last, I want to say, the last 5 or 6 years, because there has been such deep, insanely powerful organizing by immigrants in Maryland, not only have we been able to shut down ICE detention in Maryland, we also expanded Medicaid to pregnant moms, regardless of their immigration status. We have expanded the ACA, which our people never should have been excluded from. But we expanded the ACA to folks regardless of their immigration status. We have expanded the earned income tax credit, which put hundreds and hundreds of dollars back into the pockets of undocumented immigrants, right? Yes. Driver's license. We got driver's license done in Maryland, right? And then when ICE started abusing that and started digging into the DMV database, we stopped that and we decided to end all the state and local partnerships with departments of sharing information with ICE. And so I share those victories because our community is just super boss. I don't know how else to say it. Our community is just doing amazing, amazing things. And so that energy, and by the way, all of those campaigns are such heavy campaigns of that cause so much heartache, right? But I lift up those campaigns because when I reflect back on them, like the victory of all of those were just so deeply joyous. Block parties were outside Annapolis. I don't think anyone in Annapolis has seen so many Black and brown people in one place. It's been amazing. And so anyone who wants to get locked in, who's local in the many campaigns that we're doing here at CASA, let's definitely connect because the movement is growing. We still have so much more work to do.
Awesome. Maybe that's a good place to. Thank you. I think we're good.
And can we take one more, Silky?
Oh yeah, well, one more.
Okay, we're gonna do one last question.
Oh, okay. Then maybe not. We're
Fantastic. Let me just
We're good.
very briefly add on that in terms of the local organizing. Cathryn, you might want to say something in terms of faith involvement and the degree to which faith bodies are or are not working with CASA and how that factors into ground roots organizing. And Silky, I'm wondering, as you move about with the book, the response of faith organizations, so ministry is a part of my background, so I'm always looking for the degree to which faith organizations are coming at things with a rad left and with an abolitionist conscience. So I'm wondering if you've had faith feedback on the book thus far from faith community. So either of you can go into that.
I mean, I don't, there's not a scenario where any of this work has happened without faith organizations. Right. I mean, even the beginning of Detention Watch Network, it was actually like legal service providers and faith groups coming together. And I think in so many ways that I tell this story about the Chicago and Illinois fight, which is one of my favorite stories because it's an incredible game of whack-a-mole that happened to stop detention there. But I think about like Sister Pat and Sister Joanne, who were Sisters of Mercy there and who were there standing outside the detention center in the cold Chicago winters every Friday. And I feel like in every way, that struggle has been so fortified by faith groups. So I think there's been a lot. I did an event with American Friends Service Committee actually in Colorado, and it's been really, really beautiful to see. But I don't know if you want to share.
That was spot on.
Yeah.
And
there's like no separation there. Yeah.
Critical role in the state and local work, absolutely. Congregation Action Network, Unitarian Universalists, a whole number of Baptist churches. Folks have just, been there every step of the way in an amazing ally way.
And also want to mention downstairs, there's a bunch of folks together who have been at Netroots having a little caucus, but it's organized by a group called Muslims for Just Futures, which actually we work with really closely. Really incredible group doing work to really say actually this sort of the abolition ties to abolishing the war on terror and how that's affected communities here and communities abroad. And so they have some info below, but I recommend folks checking them out. Yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Can you please give Silky Shah a gigantic round of applause? It has been an honor, and am I right that you'll do some book signings?
Yeah, I can sign books, sure.
All right, so come and get your book signed, and one more time for Silky Shah.
Thank you, everyone.
Books are available right here at the table if you're paying with card. Come see me if you'd like to pay with cash.